Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, so if there are no specific issues and questions, I suggest that we quickly go to the ethics training, because as you know, in the second ethics check, the panel asked for some training sessions on specific issues. We already talked a lot about informed consent. I would like to talk today about the other, or at least some of the other topics that were included as topics for training in the second ethics check. So first of all, the issue of data minimization. This is a key issue. Why? Because the General Data Protection Regulation includes in Article 5 this principle, meaning that basically you have to limit the collection of personal information only to what is directly relevant and necessary to achieve a specific aim. And not only that, but data can also be retained only for as long is necessary to fulfill that aim. So basically, once you want to collect data, you have to inform the research participants about obviously what you want to collect and why and for how long you will collect those data before destroying them. This means that you also have to explain how the data you intend to process is relevant and limited to the purposes of the research project. But I think that, in the methodological deliverable, you have already explained, or if not, we will explain it more in the revised version, where the City Labs version, the City Labs part will be further explained why those data will be collected and why they are, let's say, compulsory to achieve the objectives of the study. And then, concerning privacy and data security, I mean, I'm trying to be as fast as possible, considering that these issues are very, very broad issues that would probably need a more specific training. But let's try and share at least the basic information. So whenever you process personal data, you must keep in mind that the processing must be necessary and proportionate in relation to, as I said, what, why, how, and for how long. We already talked about informed consent, and I think that the informed consent documents that you already provided for the previous parts of the study were perfectly fine. It will have the informed consent documents, that means information sheets and informed consent template that you will draft for, or that you are drafting for the City Labs, will have to follow, let's say, the same principles. And you must ensure compliance with the necessity and proportionality principles when you talk about collection of data. So don't collect more data or than you really need. Concerning data security, when we talk about data security, we talk about the fact that researchers must take technical and organizational measures to prevent any unauthorized access to the data you collect. So I think that this is something that you are already implementing, meaning that there are clear access rules about who can access the data. You have already established clear access rules and organize the processing in a way that gives you the best possible control. So make sure that you know who can access the data. Some examples for user authentication, so the use of strong password, access control to allow or deny access to certain data based either on predefined user list and access right and or the functions of each user. So make sure that only your research team has access to this data. And make sure that unauthorized access is not possible. Then other two important issues that are often not so clear are anonymization and pseudonymization. They are not the same thing. Why? Because anonymization is a process of ensuring that the risk of somebody being identified in the data is negligible. So basically, you cannot go back to the identity of the person. While with pseudonymization, that is in most cases was what is used in research project, is the fact that obvious identifiers such as names and addresses are replaced with indirect identifiers, so numbers or codes in the main data set. And these numbers or codes are then held with the obvious identifiers, name and addresses, in a separate data set that is often called the key. So pseudonymization is different from anonymization, and usually what is used in research is pseudonymization. So make sure that you don't, let's say, make confusion about these two issues. Then concerning, the data collection, this is something we already discussed during the training on informal consent. So basically, nobody should be subject to research project without his, her knowledge and agreement. And these are topics that we already discussed. In case, there are potentially high risk for data subject data subject rights in case of data breach. And this risk could be discrimination, once again, stigmatization, harm to welfare and the well-being, or loss of trust in science. But basically, if you follow clear rules, data protection rules, clear rules in terms of transparency, access to data, and so on, there wouldn't be a high risk for data subject rights. I think, we have already talked about these possible ethics harms that could happen if you don't apply correctly the rights of the research participants. And all this is even more relevant when vulnerable participants are involved. So basically, the involvement of vulnerable participants must be, the justification for the involvement of vulnerable participants must be provided. And you must explain clearly what you will do, how you will do, and how you will ensure that the rights of these participants are guaranteed. But who are the vulnerable participants? Not only minors, not only people unable to give informed consent that are not relevant for your study. Vulnerability is also context dependent. So it could be, for example, people who are job seekers, and you want to involve them in some research studies, and at that point they would be considered as vulnerable. The same applies to students, as we said before. If students are not free to choose whether they want to participate in a study, and they are not free to opt out and exit the study if they do not agree anymore with the objectives of the study. When you write your information sheets, you should also be clear about the possible benefits or lack of benefits that come, let's say, from the participation in the research. In some cases, there could be no benefits at all. That's obviously not a problem, but you should explain it. Make sure that participation is voluntary, and don't, as I said before, don't involve participants who are in any way dependent on you or on your staff. I would then, sorry, there is a typo here, but I would then move to the incidental findings. That is another issue that has been mentioned in the ethics check as relevant for the ethics training.
Sorry, Anna.
Yes.
Just a question about the last slide, because I was wondering if I'm quite sure that the answer is no, but I want to be sure. Because we are planning to work with organizations, NGOs, associations that work directly with vulnerable people. Mm-hmm. Vulnerable people will be not involved directly. So in that case, is it necessary some kind of attention, or they can be considered as stakeholders, not vulnerable stakeholders?
Well, if these vulnerable people are not directly involved, then there is not the risk.
Yeah, of course. Okay.
And it could happen because I understand that these NGOs will be involved in the city lab, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it could happen that during the city lab, that NGO explains to you how their work with the vulnerable participants take into account their, their right, their civic right, their social rights, and so on. But in any case, you won't work directly with vulnerable people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Concerning incidental findings, what are incidental findings? Basically, are information, let's say, are information or data that come from field work, from observation, also from interviews, and that were not foreseen at the beginning, and that go beyond the scope of the research design. And at that point, there is a dilemma for the researcher. Should he keep the confidentiality of the research participant, or should he disclose the information to relevant authorities or services? For example, in case you are you get aware of a criminal activity, of abuses, of domestic violence, and so on. So something you hadn't planned at the beginning, but following an interview, an observation, fieldwork, you are informed about that. How you should proceed. So basically, you should inform the participants of your will to disclose this information, take action, and inform either the authorities. So, for example, if there is a criminal activity, you must inform the authority, or in some cases, you should inform the NGOs, some relevant NGOs, for example, in case you are talking about incidental findings coming from vulnerable groups, such as, for example, refugees. But this is something I would say general, that does not necessarily apply to your project. I'm talking about the ethics issues coming from incidental findings. And please keep in mind that when we talk about incidental findings, in your case, we are talking about incidental findings in social studies. At the same time, in medical studies, there are incidental findings when, for example, following a medical exam, you get aware of a disease or a medical condition the research participant was not aware of. So, for example, in that case, how the researcher should proceed. In medical studies, usually the researcher, first of all, involves the general practitioner in charge of that research participant, and then discuss with him how to proceed and when informing the person involved.
One thing, Anna-Maria,
yes.
I don't know. I think that in some cases we should nuance a bit this approach on incidental findings, because I mean your last example is clear. I mean, if you find out that someone has a disease, I mean it's in the interest of these people to disclose this incidental finding. But in other case, I'm sure that we should follow this procedure to disclose in the incidental finding. I mean, for two reasons. The first is that, I mean, this incidental finding most likely is voluntarily disclosed by the participant. So, I mean, it's in, I mean, we are not asking to disclose this finding, this incidental, they decide to report it to you. And if you decide to disclose this finding outside the research project, you should do it as a private citizen, not as a researcher. I mean, for instance, I was coordinating a project on crime before SMARTDEST, and the advice that we gave to people, to researchers, was that if you witness a crime, if you want to report it as a private citizen, not as a researcher, because I mean, you might be intervening in a social context that is harmful for you and for the offenders. I mean, so I am not sure that I mean, it's very unlikely that during the city labs we will have to deal with incidental finding, because it's also a formal environment of group discussion, so it's unlikely. But since I have to answer to the Commission because they mentioned this point, I would say that I mean, possibly a more nuanced approach is preferable to avoid problems. I mean,
yes, I think that you are now, thank you, Riccardo, referring, I mean, I was probably a bit, too, let's say, strict, because indeed, well,
let's think about a practical example in SMARTDEST. No,
yes,
we conduct a research with people with a housing problem, and they decide to occupy a building, and this is a crime for the local municipality. What do? We do report this occupation? I would say rather not to. I mean,
Well, I think that, as I put here, you should be, let's say, aware of the legal context and know what could and should be done. Because, for example, a building has been occupied, okay? In this specific case, I'm pretty sure that the public authorities already know about the fact that the building is occupied. So you wouldn't disclose anything in such a case. Or did I misunderstand something?
I mean, I don't know. We should see each specific case, but in general, unless you are the victim of this incidental finding, let's think about a female field worker that is sexually harassed during the field work. Of course, disclose the information and try to be safe. But in other cases, when disclosing this incidental finding may harm disproportionately vulnerable people, such as in the case of one occupation, I would say that we should really try to be careful. That's my point.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's not possible to, let's say, decide a priori what should be done. It depends a lot on the type of incidental find you discover, and in particular on the impact on people. Because, as you said, if there is a criminal offense such as a rape, for example, in that case, you would, I mean, from the beginning, you would like to disclose the information because there has been clearly a victim. The other example you gave, this, for example, occupation, is, I would say, that is a more kind of neutral thing, because there is not a criminal offense, for example, against someone. There are not clearly victims. So we should, I mean, at that point, we should probably check if we can talk about incidental findings or not. But in any case, if there is let's say, the question if there has been an incidental finding, this is something that should be discussed among partners to decide how to proceed. And also with some lawyers, let's say, of or people from the legal department of the host institution, to know how to proceed. For example, to know if there is the the obligation to proceed and to disclose information or not. I don't know if I've been clear enough.
Understood.
Okay. Sorry. Then we talked already about the values of the global code of conduct for research in resource poor settings. I put here the link. We already discussed it in, no, we didn't discuss it, but we already mentioned in previous meetings we had. So basically this code of conduct has been developed by some experts for a research project in, as the name says, research poor settings, to avoid that there is let's say, the too strong difference in terms of power of the parts involved could create problems and undermine the rights of the research participants. For example, if you do research in countries that are poorer countries, where there are, the setting, the society is completely different from yours, and where the rights of where there is the risk that the rights of research participants are not fully respected. And this code invites to make sure that in the research project you follow this principle that, I mean, in the end are quite simple and general. That means that you are fair to the research participant, you respect them, you take care of them, and you are honest and transparent with your research participants. And I would like to invite you to read this code of conduct. Riccardo has seen it. It's very short. I think it's 4 pages, if I remember well. And you should have a look at it and understand what could be useful for you to know and to implement, for example, in the city labs, where you, in case you will involve vulnerable people. That's what that would be my suggestion.
Yes, one thing, especially for the Torino team,
Yes.
if you can please collect also information on the location of the city labs, because somewhere I have been reading that also the location itself should be as neutral as possible to avoid, I mean, tricky situation. No? Let's say a church is not a good location for a city lab. So just have the information for all the city labs.
Yeah, I agree. This is something we are discussing indeed in our case. So yeah, we will.
Okay. So from my side, I would stop here. But obviously, I see that there are some comments in the chat. I mean, of course, I'm available for replying to your questions either now or later by email.